My name was Margaret. No one remembers, but I saw the hunger growing behind the golden walls. Can you hear me? My voice echoes now, only in the wind that passes through the empty corridors, where I once ran with heavy trays in my hands. I don't know if anyone still listens to the stories of the forgotten, but I need to tell them. I need them to know that we exist too. Close your eyes and imagine it with me. Feel the cold of the stones beneath your bare feet, the sweet and bitter smell of the spices we could never taste, the distant sound of laughter echoing from the main hall, while we, in the back, chewed only the silence. This was my life. This was how I breathed. For 20 years, I walked the same halls. 20 years preparing banquets for people who never saw me as a person. They saw only hands that brought food, arms that carried weight, feet that made no sound. I was invisible, but my eyes registered everything, every waste, every excess, every crumb thrown to the floor as my stomach clenched with emptiness. The stones of the walls kept my steps, my tiredness, my silent tears. They saw me when I arrived, a 12-year-old girl with simple dreams of having something to eat every day. They saw me when I left, a shadow consumed by the irony of my own existence. I died of hunger, serving those who had never known what it was like to be hungry. You who are listening to me now are probably lying in bed, perhaps with a glass of water by your side, perhaps with the certainty that there will be breakfast tomorrow. I envy this certainty. For years I went to sleep without knowing if there would be anything to break the fast the next day. An empty stomach becomes a constant companion, a hole that whispers and groans, that reminds us every second of our condition. But I have not come here to arouse your pity. I have come to tell you my truth, so that it may mingle with your dreams and perhaps, just perhaps, make you think differently about the invisible people who still exist around you. How many Margarets serve your food? How many anonymous hands prepare what you consume? How many faces do you not see because you have learned, like the nobles, to look through people? My story is not unique. There are millions of us who have been forgotten by history. We who served, who built, who died in silence, so that others could live in abundance. Our pain does not echo in the history books because no one considered it worth remembering. But I remember every day, every night, every moment, when hunger gnawed at me inside, while I gilded swans and seasoned meats that never reached my mouth. When the palace walls rose golden in the sun, they hid not only our riches, but also our misery. Hunger grew within us like a poisonous plant, slow and inevitable. And I, Margaret, witnessed it all. I have saved every detail so that I can tell it, even if it is only to the wind, even if it is only to you who hear me now. Take a deep breath with me. Feel the weight of what I'm about to tell you. This is not just my story. It is the story of all of us who have been trampled by the golden machine of inequality. It is the confession of those who lived in the shadow of abundance and died in the cruel light of hunger. Now you know my name, Margaret. Maybe it's the first time anyone has said it in centuries. Maybe it's the last, but you heard it, and that's more than I've ever had in my life. If this story touched your heart, and you want to hear more confessions from those forgotten by history, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here means that silenced voices can still find ears willing to listen. I served for 20 years in the royal kitchens. I prepared banquets for 1,000 people, but I died on an empty stomach, listening to the echo of laughter in the hall. 20 years. Can you imagine what it must be like to live in the shadow of abundance for 20 years? 20 years of preparing with these calloused hands the finest dishes that royalty has ever tasted, while my own tongue has forgotten the taste of satiety. 20 years of carrying golden trays laden with delicacies that cost more than the lives of an entire village, while my own body slowly wasted away, day after day, in a silent hunger that no one wanted to see. Every morning, when the sun was still just a promise on the horizon, I woke up with my stomach tightening with emptiness. Every night, when I could finally lay my exhausted body on the damp straw mattress, it was the same empty stomach that accompanied me to my dreams. And in my dreams, oh, in my dreams, I ate. In my dreams, I was full. But waking up was always a renewed cruelty. I prepared feasts that could feed entire villages. I seasoned broths that could feed hundreds. I browned meats that could sustain families for months. My hands knew every rare spice, every refined technique, every secret of royal cooking. I was a hunger artist for others, a master of creating plenty for others, while I languished in my own scarcity. The laughter from the main hall echoed through the corridors like golden ghosts. It reached me muffled by the thick stone walls, but I heard it. I always heard it. Laughter from full bellies, from sated bodies, from people who had never known the metallic taste of hunger in their mouths. While I, Margaret, invisible and forgotten, prepared more and more dishes to feed more and more laughter, while my own existence became more and more tenuous, more and more transparent. You who are listening to me have probably felt hungry at some point. That common hunger, lasting a few hours, that can be solved with a meal. But I am talking about a different kind of hunger. I'm talking about the hunger that settles in your bones, that makes your teeth ache, that turns every movement into a Herculean effort. I am talking about the hunger that becomes a constant companion, a bug gnawing inside, an emptiness that echoes like a bottomless pit. And yet, even consumed by this ancient hunger, I kept going. I kept preparing, seasoning, serving, because that was what I knew how to do. That was who I was. Margaret, the invisible cook, the hand that fed without ever being fed, the shadow that held the golden light of royal banquets. 20 years of faithful service, 20 years of silent devotion, 20 years of preparing the happiness of others while swallowing my own sadness. And in the end, when my body finally gave in to eternal weariness, when my soul finally freed itself from the golden prison in which I had lived, the laughter still echoed through the hall. It continued to echo, as if nothing had changed, as if Margaret had never existed. But I existed. And now, you know, you heard my initial confession, the first whisper of a story that needs to be told. Because we are many, we the forgotten ones. We are a silent multitude of souls who lived and died in the shadow of others' abundance. I was only 12 years old when I walked through the back doors. The smell of expensive spices and the clanking of copper pots enveloped me like a whole new world. I remember it as if it were yesterday. My bare feet first touched the cold stones of the servants' hall, and it was as if I had crossed a portal into another universe. The world outside was simple, predictable, made of dirt and sweat and familiar horizons. But here inside, here it was, as if I had entered the golden belly of a mythological creature. The first scent that hit me was cinnamon, real cinnamon, not the bitter bark that sometimes found its way into the village market. This cinnamon had a sweet, complex aroma, warm as the promise of a cozy winter. Along with it came waves of other scents I couldn't even name: green cardamom, freshly grated nutmeg, saffron as golden as the sun itself, black pepper that tickled my nose even from a distance. Each spice told a story of distant lands, of caravans that crossed deserts, of ships that braved ocean storms to bring these aromatic treasures to royal kitchens. And I, a village girl who had only known coarse salt and a few wild herbs, was being introduced to this universe of flavors that cost more than the house where I was born. The noise was deafening, and yet musically coordinated. Copper pots clashed against each other, creating a metallic symphony that echoed through the stone vaults. They were enormous pots, some so large I could have bathed in them, all polished to a shine like golden mirrors. The copper was so pure, so well cared for, that it reflected the flames from the furnaces, creating dances of light across the walls. There was also the rhythmic sound of knives on cutting boards, a constant staccato that marked time like a giant heartbeat. Dozens of hands working in sync, each one knowing exactly what it was supposed to do, each movement calculated and precise. It was like watching an ancient dance, a ritual that repeated itself day after day with the same sacred precision. My childish eyes tried to absorb everything at once. The shelves that went up to the ceiling, loaded with ceramic jars decorated with designs that I couldn't read. Some contained crystallized sugar that sparkled like precious stones. Others held flowers so white they looked like sifted snow. And still others hid preserves of exotic fruits that looked like liquid jewels inside the jars. Black iron cauldrons steamed over stone hearths, releasing steam that sent aromatic clouds into the air. Some gave off the rich scent of bone broth that had been simmering all night. Others gave off the sweet aromas of jams and jellies that had been slowly cooking to perfect consistency. I was so small that I had to crane my neck to see the carcasses of wild boar and deer hanging from hooks in the ceiling. They swayed slightly in the movement of the hot air rising from the ovens, creating dancing shadows on the walls. To me, who had only known skinny chickens and village pigs, this was a spectacle of abundance that was impossible to comprehend. The other servants looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. I was obviously new, obviously lost, obviously not part of that sophisticated world. My village clothes contrasted sharply with the clean, tidy aprons they wore. My disheveled hair betrayed my humble origins, and my unsteady gait showed that I didn't know the rules of that place. But there was something in my eyes, a hunger that wasn't just physical. It was a hunger to belong, to learn, to become part of that coordinated dance of flavors and aromas. I wanted to unlock the secrets of those shiny pots. I wanted to learn the language of those exotic spices. I wanted my hands to also know how to create the culinary miracles I saw around me. On that first day, standing in the middle of that immense kitchen, surrounded by heavenly aromas and rhythmic sounds, I had no idea that this would be my golden prison for the next 20 years. I had no idea that this paradise of flavors would become my own personal hell. On that morning, when I was 12, I still believed that being there was a blessing, an opportunity, a gateway to a better life. How wrong I was. The tyrant chef, the other older servants, the silent competition, every crumb was watched, every bone counted. Chef Auguste dominated the kitchen like a cruel king rules his kingdom. He was an immense man, not only in height, but in presence. When he entered the kitchen, the very air seemed to constrict around him. His voice echoed through the stone vaults with an authority that made all other sounds disappear. Even the bubbling of the cauldrons seemed to quieten when he spoke. His eyes were small and piercing, like those of a hawk watching potential prey. Nothing escaped his vigilance. He knew exactly how many onions had been peeled, how many liters of broth had been prepared, how many slices of bread had been cut. Every ingredient had its place. Every movement had its purpose. Every second had its function. And he controlled it all with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He always carried a wooden stick, which he called his stick of justice. He said it was for stirring large pots, but we all knew it was also his weapon of intimidation. The sound of that stick hitting the side of the pots was enough to make anyone sit up straight and work with renewed vigor. When he was particularly angry, he would slam the stick down on the central wooden table, creating a loud crash that echoed throughout the kitchen like thunder. Below him were the veteran cooks, women who had spent decades in this environment, who knew every secret, every recipe, every method. They were like guardians of ancient knowledge, but jealous and cruel guardians. They had earned their places through years of suffering, and they were not willing to share that knowledge easily with the newcomers. Marie, the oldest, had gray hair that was always pulled back in a tight bun that pulled at her skin, giving her a permanently stern expression. Her hands were like claws, scarred from decades of hard work, calloused and burned from countless accidents. She controlled the preparation of the main sauces, a knowledge she kept as a personal treasure. None of us knew exactly what secret ingredients she added, and she made sure to keep that mystery. Then there was Bertha, the meat keeper, who had a temper as hot as the ovens she operated. She could tell the exact doneness of a food by smell alone, an almost supernatural ability that made her indispensable. But her expertise was accompanied by a gratuitous cruelty. She delighted in making the younger girls cry, creating impossible tasks, setting unattainable standards just to see the despair in our eyes. Among us, younger servants, there was a silent and fierce competition. We could not afford to make real friends, because each of us was fighting for our survival. Every extra crumb one of us got meant less to the others. Every compliment one of us received meant criticism to the others. Every small privilege one of us gained was envied and resented by the others. I quickly learned that showing weakness was an invitation to slaughter. If you stumbled, if you dropped something, if you showed signs of fatigue or hunger, the others would swoop down like ravenous vultures, not out of pure malice, but out of self-preservation. Each of us knew that our place in the kitchen hierarchy depended on keeping the others below us on the social ladder of that cruel microcosm. The servants' meals were distributed with a mathematical precision that bordered on obsession. Chef Auguste personally controlled every portion, weighed every piece of bread, measured every spoonful of watery soup we were given. He wrote everything down in a black leather notebook, recording who ate what, when they ate it, how much they ate. He said it was to maintain discipline and avoid waste. Every bone was literally counted. After we finished our meager meal, we had to hand the bones back to him so he could check to see if anyone had managed to extract any extra marrow, any bits of meat that might have been left over. The bones were then boiled again to make secondary broths, and even these broths were measured and controlled. If any of us were caught trying to sneak an extra bite of food, The consequences were severe, not only physical punishment, such as overtime or even a reduction in rations, but also public humiliation. Chef Auguste made a point of announcing the betrayal to the entire kitchen, making an example of the guilty party for the others. I developed an almost animalistic ability to identify hierarchies and alliances. I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was in disgrace, when one of the veterans was plotting against a newcomer, when Chef Auguste was in a particularly cruel mood. This awareness became my survival tool, my way of navigating the treacherous waters of that environment. There were times when I looked around and wondered if this was really life, or if we were all just ghosts, trapped in an eternal ritual of suffering, each of us fighting against the others, all of us serving a system that dehumanized us, that turned us into instruments of culinary production rather than people with dreams, fears, and needs. But that was how the royal kitchen worked. That was how the hierarchy was maintained. That was how every crumb was watched, every bone counted, every soul broken and shaped to serve the abundance of others. Waking up before dawn, working until dawn, my hands were bruised, my feet were swollen, the weariness in my bones. My dreams smelled of roast meat I'd never tasted. The church bell had not yet rung when my eyes opened to the pitch-black darkness of the servants' dormitory. There were no windows down here, just damp stone walls that weeped constant droplets. The air was thick with the breath of 24 women who slept huddled together on rough wooden bunks, each one trying to find warmth in paper-thin blankets, each one fighting the chill rising up from the stone floor. My body always woke up at the same time, an internal clock calibrated by the fear of being late. Being late meant starting the day with a scolding from Chef Auguste. It meant losing the few precious minutes we had to prepare. It meant starting the daily marathon already at a disadvantage. Getting up was a new agony each morning. My feet, swollen from the previous day's work, protested the cold ground. It was as if 1,000 pins were piercing the soles with each step. For the first few months, I wept silently as I wore the worn shoes that had belonged to another servant before me. Shoes that didn't fit properly, that hurt in new ways every day, but that were all I had. My hands were a map of suffering. Each finger told a story of burns, cuts, and calluses that formed and broke in endless cycles. My fingertips had lost their sensitivity from peeling potatoes with dull knives, from stirring boiling broths, from handling ingredients that corroded my skin. When I interlaced my fingers to pray before bed, I felt the roughness and irregularities that turned my hands into work tools instead of parts of my body. The first task of the day was always to light the stoves. This meant carrying firewood from the storerooms to the kitchen, firewood that weighed almost as much as I did. My thin village girl arms grew stronger over time, but never without pain. Every log carried, every bundle of twigs carried, every flame stoked cost me a bit of my life force. Then came the basic preparations, peeling mountains of vegetables that arrived covered in dirt, each one requiring special care. The carrots had to be scraped until they were perfectly orange, with no trace of skin. The potatoes had to be peeled in perfect spirals, with no waste. Each eye, the onions made me cry tears that mixed physical pain with emotional sadness, tears that no one distinguished or valued. My work stretched out for 15, sometimes 16, consecutive hours. By the time the last pots and pans were washed, the countertops were scrubbed, until they shone. The ovens were cleaned and prepared for the next day. My body had already surpassed all limits of human endurance. Her feet became two painful masses of swollen flesh. Inside her shoes, she felt as if she were walking on sharp rocks with every step. At night, when she could finally take them off, she always discovered new sores, new bruises, new torn skin. Soaking her feet in cold water was a momentary relief that soon turned into new torture. When she had to put her shoes back on the next morning, my back ached constantly. Spending hours leaning over low countertops, carrying heavy pots and pans, standing without rest for endless periods of time, it all took its toll. It was a dull ache that radiated from the base of my neck all the way down to my lower back, an ache that intensified with fatigue and never completely went away. But perhaps the worst part was the weariness that settled into my bones. It wasn't just muscular fatigue, it was something deeper. It was as if my lifeblood was being sucked away, drop by drop, day after day. My bones felt like lead, my muscles like soggy cotton. Every movement required conscious effort. Every gesture cost energy I didn't have. And then came the dreams. Oh, my dreams were a separate territory, a place where my hungry mind created impossible feasts. I dreamed of eating roast meat, succulent and seasoned with all those exotic spices I had handled during the day. In the dream, I cut thick slices of meat that melted in my mouth, releasing intense flavors that my real palate had never known. I also dreamed of a warm bread, fresh from the oven, with a golden crust that crackled between my teeth and a soft crumb that dissolved on my tongue like clouds. I dreamed of sweet, juicy fruits, of creamy cheeses, of elaborate desserts that I had helped to prepare but had never tasted. Waking from these dreams was a renewed cruelty. For a few blessed seconds, between sleep and wakefulness, I could still taste the imaginary in my mouth. But then, reality would come back like a bucket of cold water, and I would remember where I was, who I was, and that it would be another day identical to the previous ones. My dreams smelled of roast meat that I had never tasted. That was the perfume that accompanied me during sleep, an olfactory torture that my mind created from the memories of the aromas that it manipulated without being able to consume. They were cruel dreams, but they were also my only escape, my only moment of satiety, even if imaginary. This was my daily routine. This was how I existed, more than lived, in that limbo between the abundance I created and the hunger I felt. Details of the luxurious dishes, golden peacocks, rare wines, elaborate sweets. I carried trays that cost more than my entire village. The bitter irony of preparing abundance for those who wasted it. Royal banquets were spectacles of decadence that defied description. Imagine, if you will, a table that stretched the entire length of the great hall, covered with a linen tablecloth that had been woven with threads of real gold. A tablecloth that alone was worth more than all the money my family had seen in generations. The peacocks arrived alive in our kitchens, majestic birds with plumage that glittered like jewels in the torchlight. But what we did with them was pure culinary alchemy. First, we carefully removed each feather, preserving it intact for the final presentation. Then we seasoned the meat with spices that came from lands so far away I could not even pronounce their names. The process of gilding peacocks was an art that took hours. Each bird was coated with a mixture of beaten eggs, pure saffron, and real gold dust. Yes, gold that could be eaten. Gold that could pass through the human body without being absorbed, just to create a stunning visual effect. When they emerged from the ovens, the peacocks literally glowed, as if they were divine sculptures made of precious metal. But the most impressive part came during the presentation. We put all the feathers back in their original positions, creating the illusion that the bird was alive, just sleeping on the tray. The tail was spread out in a full fan, each feather positioned with millimeter precision. The eyes were replaced by small pearls that sparkled in the candlelight, creating an almost hypnotic effect. I carried these trays of golden peacocks, and the weight was both physical and emotional. Each tray weighed more than I could comfortably carry, but the weight of knowing their value was even greater. A single bird of these cost more than my entire village, earned in a year of hard work, and there were always at least 6 peacocks at every feast. The wines were another story in themselves. They arrived in barrels, marked with seals, from regions that I had learned to identify by their aromas alone. Wines that had been stored in cellars for decades, some older than I was. When Chef Auguste opened these barrels, the aroma that spread through the kitchen was intoxicating. Notes of fruits I had never tasted, hints of spices that cost a fortune, earthy nuances that spoke of distant soils and seasons I would never experience. There were sweet wines made from grapes that had been sun-dried for months, creating concentrations of sugar that were almost medicinal in their intensity. Other wines were desert dry, with tannins that made your mouth pucker. And the sparkling wines, just from the aroma, oh, those were pure magic. When the bottles were opened, they released clouds of golden foam that danced in the air like tiny liquid fireworks. But it was the sweets that represented the height of culinary decadence. Architectural constructions made of crystallized sugar, marzipan molded into impossible shapes, chocolates imported from New World lands that literally cost their weight in gold. There were towers of sweets that rose like miniature cathedrals, each floor decorated with candied fruits that glittered like precious gems. I particularly remember one dessert that took weeks to make. It was a miniature replica of the palace itself, made entirely of sugar, marzipan, and chocolate. Every window was drawn in melted chocolate. Every tower was individually molded. Every architectural detail was reproduced with obsessive precision. When finished, the dessert could feed a family for months, but it served only as a table decoration, something to impress guests before being partially consumed and then discarded. I carried these trays laden with culinary treasures, and with every step I felt the weight of irony. My hands, which had helped create these wonders, trembled not only from the physical weight, but from the realization of what it represented. Each dish I carried into the main dining room was worth more than everything my family had ever owned in their entire lives. And then I saw the waste. Oh, the waste was the cruelest part of it all. Entire dishes, culinary masterpieces that had taken days to prepare, were left untouched on the tables. The nobles would taste a spoonful or two and then move on to the next course, leaving mountains of food behind. Whole pieces of golden peacock were left on plates, with only small bites taken. Rare wines were left in glasses, slowly losing their precious aromas to the air. Elaborate sweets were broken up for visual effect, with most of them discarded without ever reaching a mouth. When I collected these trays at the end of the feasts, my heart broke into tiny pieces. I saw enough food to feed entire villages being thrown away, while my own stomach clenched with hunger. It was a brutal lesson in the nature of abundance and scarcity. in how both can coexist in the same space, separated only by stone walls and social conventions. The bitter irony of it all stayed with me during long sleepless nights. I, who knew every ingredient, every technique, every secret of those culinary creations, would never be able to taste them. I, whose hands had shaped those wonders, was condemned to remain forever outside the feast, watching through the cracks in the kitchen door as others enjoyed my life's work. This was how royal banquets worked. This was how abundance was celebrated by those who had never known hunger, prepared by those who had never known satiety. The servants' rations were gradually decreasing. They said it was a matter of economy, that the kingdom was going through difficulties, but the banquets continued to be sumptuous. The change was so subtle at first that we hardly noticed. It was like watching the tide go out. You only notice it when the beach is completely exposed. Our daily ration, already meager, began to shrink in almost imperceptible ways. First, it was a spoonful, less of watery soup, then a thinner slice of brown bread, then a smaller piece of hard cheese. Chef Auguste announced the changes in his usual authoritative voice, but there was something different in his eyes, a tension that he tried to hide behind the mask of professional severity. He gathered us in the central kitchen, tapping his wooden stick on the main table to get our attention. As he always did, "The kingdom is going through difficult times," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone vaults. "Poor harvests, disrupted trade, matters of state beyond your comprehension. It is our duty as loyal servants to do our part to sustain the palace economy." Economy. This word became a constant presence in our lives, a justification he used for every reduction, every cut, every new restriction. Economy of ingredients, economy of resources, economy of everything that could make our existence a little less miserable. But the cruel irony of it all was that the banquets continued exactly as before. No, in fact, they seemed to be getting even more elaborate, even more extravagant. While our portions grew smaller by the day, I continued to prepare the same golden peacocks, the same rare wines, the same architectural sweets that cost a fortune. The mathematics of hunger are cruel and precise. When you're already on the edge of subsistence, any reduction becomes exponentially more devastating. Losing a spoonful of soup when you have 5 is different than losing a spoonful when you only have 2. That one less spoonful represented a significant percentage of our daily survival. I began counting every grain of salt, every crumb of bread, every drop of broth that reached my plate. I developed an obsessive mental math, calculating exactly how many hours of work I could sustain with that amount of food, how many tasks I could accomplish before my body began to tremble with weakness. The other servants began to show physical signs of their shortage. Marie, the veteran sauce maker, who had always been robust and imposing, began to look smaller. Her clothes became looser, her cheeks sunken, her eyes grew larger in a face that was gradually shrinking. Bertha, the meat specialist, developed a persistent tremor in her hands, which she tried to hide by keeping them constantly busy. I could feel my body adapting to the scarcity in ways I hadn't known were possible. My periods stopped completely, as if my body had decided it didn't have enough resources to support reproductive functions. My hair, which was already thin, began to fall out in clumps, leaving sparse patches that I tried to hide under my work cap. The cold became an even more relentless enemy. Without enough body fat to insulate me, I felt every draft like an icy stab. Even working next to the hot ovens, My body shivered constantly, expending precious energy I didn't have just trying to maintain a minimally functional body temperature. Chef Auguste tried to maintain discipline through explanations that sounded increasingly hollow. He talked about patriotic sacrifices, about our contribution to the greater good of the kingdom, about how our suffering was temporary and necessary. But his own cheeks remained rosy and full. His body remained robust and strong. He was clearly not participating in the same economy that he imposed on us. Tensions between us servants escalated dramatically. Competition for every extra crumb became fierce and desperate. Petty thefts began to occur. A crust of bread that disappeared, a bit of broth that went missing from the cauldron, a piece of bone that wasn't returned for counting. Each of us became suspicious of the others, every gesture interpreted as potential betrayal. I developed coping strategies I never thought I would need. I learned to work more slowly, to conserve energy, to breathe more slowly so I wouldn't faint, to drink large amounts of water, to fill my stomach, and temporarily stave off hunger. I discovered that chewing mint leaves that grew on the backyard patio helped to ease the empty feeling in my stomach. During the preparations for the banquets, the temptation became almost unbearable. The aroma of the food we prepared seemed more intense, more seductive. My mouth was constantly watering, and I had to swallow excessive saliva that accumulated just from the smell of the food. There were times when my vision blurred with desire, when I had to hold on to the counters to keep from fainting from the urge to eat. But the cruelest thing was to watch the waste continue exactly as before. The same untouched dishes returned from the tables, the same expensive wines were spilled, the same elaborate sweets were discarded. The wasted abundance had not diminished in the slightest. While our scarcity deepened daily, I began to understand that the economy was not a matter of limited resources, but of priorities. The resources existed, they were just not considered necessary for our survival. We were a cost that could be cut without visible consequences to those making the decisions. Our hunger was invisible, our weakness was irrelevant, our survival was disposable. During the long sleepless nights brought on by hunger, I would stare at the ceiling of my dorm room and try to understand the logic behind it all. How could abundance and scarcity coexist in the same space? How could the same hands that prepared abundance be left to wither away from hunger? The answer came gradually, like a bitter revelation that settled into my bones along with the constant cold. We were not seen as people. We were tools, instruments of culinary production that could be kept running with the minimum amount of fuel required. Our humanity was irrelevant, our dignity a luxury we could not afford, our hunger an acceptable price to pay for maintaining the system. This was how the first signs of hunger manifested themselves, gradually, subtly, inexorably. And while our strength waned, the banquets continued to be sumptuous, as if our misery were the fair price to pay for the abundance of others. Licking dirty plates, hiding bread crusts, drinking broth water, I learned to chew slowly to trick my stomach. The silent degradation of dignity. Real hunger turns you into an animal. It's not a dramatic transformation. It's something that happens gradually, like the erosion of a rock by water. One day you're a person with dignity. The next day, you're licking dirty plates, and you don't care what that means anymore. The first time I licked a plate was almost by accident. I was washing the dishes from the previous night's banquet, and there was a plate with a bit of golden sauce left on it that glistened like honey in the candlelight. The aroma was so intense, so seductive, that before my mind could even process what I was doing, my tongue was touching the cold porcelain. The taste was a revelation. It wasn't just food. It was like I'd touched heaven itself. Complex spices that danced on my palate, rich fats that my body desperately craved, sugars that made my starving brain explode with pleasure. For a few blessed seconds, I forgot where I was, who I was, what had brought me to this moment of degradation. But when the taste wore off, shame set in. A shame so deep that it made me double over the stone sink. I had crossed a line I hadn't known existed. I had stepped down a rung on the ladder of human dignity that I might never climb back up. But hunger does not understand dignity. Hunger is a biological imperative that nullifies all social conventions, all moral codes, all concepts of right and wrong. And so, that first plate licking became a habit, then a necessity, then an essential part of my survival strategy. I developed techniques for licking plates without being seen. I learned to identify which plates had been handled the least, which were most likely to contain usable leftovers. I preferred dessert plates, where there were often sugar crystals stuck to the edges, or sauce plates, where there were always small golden puddles of precious fat. Hiding bread crusts became an art that I mastered with great skill. Crusts were usually discarded during the preparation of more refined dishes, considered too rustic for the royal palate. But to me, each crust was a treasure. I hid them inside the folds of my clothes, in the secret pockets I sewed into my apron, even inside my shoes when necessary. There were secret places around the kitchen where I kept these little treasures. A crevice between two stones in the wall where I could hide crumbs wrapped in rags. A hollow space behind a shelf where I kept hardened bread crusts that I would then soften with water when no one was looking. Each hiding place was carefully chosen and memorized, like a survival map that only I knew. The stock water became my liquid salvation. After the main stocks were served, there was always water left at the bottom of the stock pots, water that had absorbed flavors and nutrients during cooking. Officially, this water was discarded or used to wash pots, but I discovered that I could drink it when no one was paying attention. It wasn't just water. It was an extremely diluted soup, but it still carried traces of fat, tiny particles of meat, traces of vegetables. To my starving body, every sip was precious. I drank slowly, savoring every trace of flavor, trying to extract as much nutrition as possible from that golden liquid. I also learned the art of slow chewing. When I finally got a real bite of food, whether through official channels or my own secret strategies, I would chew it with meditative slowness. Each bite was prolonged, each flavor explored fully, each texture analyzed by my desperate tongue. I discovered that chewing slowly not only made my food last longer, it also tricked my stomach. The prolonged act of chewing sent signals to my brain that I was eating more than I actually was. It was a biological illusion, but one that helped me endure the long hours until the next feeding opportunity. There were other tricks I developed through desperate experience. Drinking large amounts of water before meals made my stomach feel temporarily full. Chewing mint leaves lessened the feeling of hunger and refreshed my mouth. Pressing certain points on my abdomen helped relieve the hunger cramps that doubled over me with pain. I also began to observe the eating habits of the rats that infested the kitchen. They taught me where to find forgotten crumbs, when were the best times to forage for food without being discovered, how to move silently through the hallways at night. I was literally learning survival tactics from rodents. The degradation of dignity did not occur only in physical acts, but also in mental transformation. I stopped seeing myself as Margaret, the village girl with dreams and hopes. I began to see myself as a walking stomach, a biological need that had to be satisfied at any cost. My thoughts were reduced to a constant obsession with food, with opportunities for nourishment, with survival strategies. I lost the ability to have normal conversations with the other servants. When we did talk, it was always about food, about hunger, about who had gotten an extra piece of something, about rumors of possible changes in rations. Our relationships became purely transactional, based on exchanging information about food opportunities or temporary alliances to hide survival activities. There were nights when I would lie awake, not from insomnia, but from a hypervigilance for food. My ears were always alert for any sound that might indicate an opportunity. The sound of someone dropping food, the sound of scraps being discarded, the movement of the night that might mask my own foraging activities. My body developed a heightened sensitivity to detect food smells from impossible distances. I could identify different types of bread being baked 3 floors up. I could distinguish between different types of sauce just by the aroma wafting down the hallways. This olfactory hypersensitivity became both a blessing and a torture, alerting me to opportunities, but also intensifying my suffering. The silent degradation of dignity was perhaps the cruelest part of it all. Each act of survival took me a little further away from the person I had been. Each plate licked, each crumb hidden, each sip of stolen broth was another step down the ladder of dehumanization. But I learned to chew slowly, to trick my stomach. I learned to find nutrients in other people's leftovers. I learned to survive when survival seemed impossible. And if it cost me my dignity, if it turned Margaret into something she no longer recognized, at least it kept me alive for another day, another week, another month in that golden hell. That was how I tried to survive. That was how hunger transformed me. That was how human dignity dissolved, drop by drop, plate by plate, until all that was left was the animal instinct to continue existing. Bad harvests, distant popular revolts, whispers of war. Outside, the people cried out for bread. Inside, more swans were gilded. The contrast between external reality and the Palatine bubble. The rumors reached us like distant echoes from a world falling apart. We had no direct access to the news, but the palace walls could not completely contain the whispers that spread like wildfire through the halls. Merchants bringing supplies spoke in hushed tones of failed harvests. Merchants whispered of dangerous roads, and even the nobles seemed more tense during their visits to the kitchens. The first time I heard about the bad harvests was from a grain carrier. He was unloading sacks of wheat into the pantry, and I could hear him talking to the storekeeper. He talked about whole fields of wheat that had rotted on the vine, about rains that had come too late or too early, about pests that had devastated entire crops. His voice carried a deep concern that contrasted sharply with the abundance I saw around me. But inside the palace, it was as if these problems belonged to another world, another reality completely disconnected from our own. The requests for banquets not only remained the same, but seemed to be becoming even more extravagant. It was as if the crisis outside were a personal challenge to royal ostentation, as if each external problem demanded an internal response of even greater abundance. While farmers were losing their crops, we were gilding more swans. Yes, swans, which cost a fortune to bring from distant lands, which required even more elaborate preparation techniques than peacocks. Each gilded swan represented what dozens of families would need to survive for months, yet they arrived in our kitchens as if they were common ingredients. The process of preparing swans was even more complex than anything we had done before. First, the birds had to be slaughtered in a ritualistic manner, preserving the integrity of their skins. Then, they were stuffed with a mixture of other exotic meats: pheasant, partridge, even young venison. The stuffing was seasoned with spices that were literally worth their weight in gold: pure saffron, green cardamom, long pepper imported from remote islands. Each swan took 2 full days to prepare properly. The first day was devoted to cleaning and seasoning, the second to slow cooking that preserved the delicate texture of the meat. During cooking, the birds were constantly doused with imported wine that cost more than a skilled artisan's annual salary. But the final touch was what really left me speechless. Each swan was covered in a thin sheet of real gold, applied with sable hair brushes. The gold was hammered so thin it was almost transparent, then applied to the bird's golden skin. The end result was a creature that looked as if it had been forged by the gods themselves, glowing in the candlelight like a divine vision. Meanwhile, whispers of popular revolts reached us through the servants who came from outside. They spoke of crowds gathering in the town squares, crying out for bread, for work, for justice. They described scenes of despair in which entire families fought over scraps of food with stray dogs, in which children cried with hunger in the streets while the rich passed by in gilded carriages. The stories were fragmentary, censored, but they still managed to paint a horrific picture of the reality beyond the palace walls. They told of bakeries being looted, of grain stores being overrun by hungry mobs, of local officials fleeing in the face of popular anger. It was as if the entire kingdom were on fire, while we remained in a gilded bubble of artificial abundance. And the whispers of war were perhaps the most frightening. They came from soldiers passing through the palace, from messengers bringing official correspondence, from nobles talking in low voices in the corridors. They spoke of armies being mobilized, of alliances being formed, of preparations for conflicts that could devastate the entire kingdom. But even this dire news did nothing to dampen the pace of the banquets. If anything, it seemed to heighten the urgency of ostentation. It was as if each meal were a declaration of war against external reality, as if each elaborate dish were an act of defiance against the forces that threatened the kingdom. I carried trays of golden swans, while knowing that people were starving outside. I poured wines that cost a fortune, while hearing whispers of families selling their children for food. I made elaborate desserts, while the distant echoes of protests reached us through the shuttered windows. The contrast was so stark that I sometimes wondered if I had gone mad, if I was living in 2 parallel realities that should not be allowed to coexist. How was it possible that so much abundance and so much misery could exist simultaneously? How was it possible that the answer to the kingdom's problems was to gild more swans instead of feeding more people? At night, when I could finally lay my head on the straw pillow, I would hear distant sounds that might have been wind, but sometimes sounded like screams of crowds, cries of hunger, cries of despair that echoed through the darkness, until they reached my ears. But in the morning, when I woke, everything was the same. The ovens were lit, the spices were prepared, the swans were gilded, the Palatine bubble seemed impenetrable. The thick stone walls not only protected us physically from the outside world, but also seemed to create a psychological barrier that made it impossible for those living inside it to understand the reality of those living outside. It was as if we existed in different dimensions, governed by completely different physical laws. And I, Margaret, was caught between these two realities, hungry, like those who cried out in the streets, but forced to serve those who isolated themselves from the hunger of others. I knew intimately what it was like to suffer from scarcity, but I had to dedicate my life to creating abundance for others. It was a position of existential torture that consumed me from within as much as the hunger consumed my body. Outside, the people were crying out for bread. Inside, more swans were being gilded. And I, in the midst of it all, continued to carry trays that were worth human lives, preparing banquets that could save entire villages, serving an abundance that grew more obscene with each passing day. This is how the crisis deepened. This is how two realities coexisted in the same world. This is how I learned that hunger and abundance can inhabit the same space, separated only by the thickness of a stone wall and the infinite cruelty of human indifference. Colleagues disappearing one by one, dismissed or dying of weakness. I saw Sarah faint over her soup. We never saw her again. The growing fear and loneliness. Sarah was like a sister to me. She had arrived at the palace only a few months after me. Also, a village girl with simple dreams and naive hopes. We shared the same bunk in the servants' dormitory, whispered conversations during the cold nights, shared the few moments of relief we could steal from our brutal routine. She had blonde hair that shone like ripe wheat when the sunlight managed to penetrate the small kitchen windows. Her eyes were blue, like the summer sky we both remembered from our lost villages. But as the months passed, as the crisis deepened, I saw that glow gradually fade, like a candle slowly burning out. The first time I noticed something was wrong with Sarah was when she began to stumble frequently. Small stumbles at first, which she covered with embarrassed smiles and mumbled apologies. But gradually, the stumbles became more frequent, more dangerous. She would drop dishes, bump into other servants, lose her balance while carrying heavy trays. Chef Auguste noticed too, of course. His hawk-like eyes missed nothing, especially no signs of weakness that might affect the kitchen's efficiency. He began yelling at Sarah more often, criticizing her every clumsy move, treating her as if her difficulties were the result of laziness or incompetence rather than starvation. "Concentrate, girl," he would yell when she dropped a spoon or spilled some broth. "We don't have time for sloppiness in this kitchen." But I saw what he refused to acknowledge. I saw Sarah's hands shaking when she thought no one was looking. I saw the way she held on to the counters discreetly to keep from falling. I saw the way her eyes would go unfocused sometimes, as if she were looking at a world we couldn't see. The other handmaids began to avoid her, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. We all knew that weakness was contagious in that environment. If you were seen associating with someone who was failing, you might be marked as next in line for dismissal. It was a brutal logic of survival that turned potential friends into wary strangers. Sarah tried to hide her deterioration, but it was impossible. Her skin had turned a translucent pallor that left the blue veins visible like maps of rivers beneath its surface. Her cheeks, once rosy and full, were now dark caverns that made her eyes seem enormous in a face that was shrinking daily. She developed a persistent cough that echoed through the dormitory at night, a dry, tearing cough that kept her awake and consequently kept the rest of us awake as well. Some of the other servants began to complain, saying they needed to sleep in order to work the next day. The solidarity that should have existed between us was being eroded by exhaustion and fear. The moment that changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday. Sarah was helping to prepare a vegetable soup for the servants' lunch. Ironically, our own meal, a watery concoction that barely deserved to be called soup. She was leaning over the pot, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon, when suddenly her body just gave way. It was like watching a rag doll lose its stuffing. Her knees buckled, her arms went limp, and she fell forward, straight into the steaming cauldron. The sound was terrible. The splash of hot water, the muffled scream, the metallic clang of the wooden spoon hitting the side of the pot. I rushed to help her, along with Marie and 2 other servants. We managed to pull her out of the cauldron before she drowned, but she was unconscious, wet and burned by the hot water. Her skin had turned a grayish color that reminded me of corpses, and her breathing was so weak that we had to lean over her to make sure she was still alive. Chef Auguste arrived, drawn by the noise and confusion. He looked at Sarah, passed out on the kitchen floor, as if she were a personal inconvenience, an obstacle he had deliberately placed in his path. He showed no concern for her well-being, did not ask if she was injured, did not offer medical help. "Get her out of here," he ordered, with a coldness that chilled my blood, "and throw away that soup. It's contaminated." 2 older servants carried Sarah out of the kitchen. I tried to follow them, but Chef Auguste blocked my path with his wooden stick. "You have work to do," he said, looking at me with those small, cruel eyes. "The kitchen doesn't stop because a weak servant can't stand." That was the last time I saw Sarah. That night, when I returned to the dormitory, her bed was empty. Her few personal possessions, a wooden comb, a piece of cloth that had once belonged to her mother, small wooden cross, were gone. It was as if she had never existed. When I asked the other servants about her, I got only blank looks and vague answers. She was dismissed, one would mutter. She went home, another would whisper, but their eyes told a different story. We all knew Sarah hadn't come home. We all knew she probably hadn't even left the palace alive. From that day on, other servants began to disappear with increasing frequency, always following the same pattern. First came the signs of weakness, then the stumbles and fainting, then the mysterious dismissal. 1 week, Agnes, the girl who worked in the bakery, disappeared. 2 weeks later, it was Elena's turn, who helped prepare meats. Then Margaret, not me, but another Margaret, a red-haired girl who wept silently as she worked. Fear settled among us like a plague. It wasn't just the fear of death, but the fear of invisibility, of complete erasure. These girls didn't just die physically. They were removed from existence as if they had never mattered. Their names were not mentioned. Their memories were not honored. Their lives left no trace. We developed a collective paranoia about signs of weakness. Every hand tremor, every moment of dizziness, every gasp for breath became a cause for panic. We tried to hide from each other any sign of deterioration, creating an atmosphere of distrust and isolation that prevented us from seeking mutual support. Loneliness became our most faithful companion. We could not afford to create emotional bonds because we knew that these people could disappear at any moment. Every friendship was an open door to pain. Every shared affection was an emotional investment that could be lost without warning. I began to avoid looking directly at the younger servants. They always arrived with the same hope in their eyes, the same determination, the same naive faith that they would survive. But I already knew how the story would end. I had seen too many of these stories come to an end. I watched Sarah pass out in her soup. We never saw her again. And that phrase became a silent mantra that we all carried, a reminder that our own existence was as fragile as hers, as disposable as hers, as forgettable as hers. Growing fear and loneliness became part of our collective identity. We were ghosts tending to ghosts, shadows serving shadows, all of us just waiting our turn to disappear like Sarah had. This was life in royal kitchens. This was how the forgotten died. This was how the system kept itself running, by discarding the broken parts and replacing them with new ones, never stopping to question why so many parts broke. My body had forgotten how to digest real food. I reached the point where I tried to eat wax candles, chew leather, and drink dirty water. The physical and mental deterioration was slowly eating away at me. There comes a time when hunger stops being just a physical sensation and becomes a living entity inside you, a creature that gnaws, that whispers, that turns every thought into a desperate search for any substance that can trick an empty stomach. That's how I got to the point where I looked at the yellowish wax candles that lit the hallways and saw not decoration, but possible food. The first candle I tried to eat was nearly burnt out, a melted stub that someone had left on a stone table. I waited until everyone was asleep, until the hallways were empty, before sneaking up on it. My hands shook as I picked up the waxy mass, still warm from the residual heat of the extinguished flame. The smell was sickening, a mixture of rendered animal fat and accumulated soot. Scraping the wax off with my teeth was an experience I've never forgotten. The material crumbled into irregular pieces that stuck to my teeth, creating a pasty, disgusting sensation. I tried to swallow it, but my body instinctively rejected the substance. It wasn't food. My body knew that, but my desperate mind insisted that anything was better than absolute emptiness. The leather scraps came later. I found an old belt abandoned in a servant's chest, probably belonging to someone who had died or been discharged. It was tanned leather, hard as stone, but I saw it as a possible substance. I cut thin strips with a dull knife, trying to soften them by boiling them in water for hours. The boiled leather tasted like concentrated sadness. It was fibrous, impossible to chew properly, releasing a flavor that was part salt, part death, part human despair. My jaw ached from hours of trying to break the substance into pieces small enough to swallow. And when I finally managed to swallow, it felt like I was devouring my own dignity. Dirty water became my last resort. Water left over from washing dishes, water that had been used to wash vegetables, water that carried microscopic remnants of food that others had consumed. I filtered it through old cloths, removing the larger pieces of dirt, but drinking the rest with pathetic gratitude. My body began to rebel against these desperate attempts at nourishment. My digestive system, deprived of real food for so long, had forgotten how to process substances. Even when I managed to swallow small pieces of moldy bread or the peels of rotten fruit, My stomach violently rejected them. I even vomited bile, losing even more of the few nutrients it had managed to absorb. The physical deterioration was cruel and unrelenting. My skin became translucent, so thin that the veins appeared like dark rivers mapping my decay. My hair fell out in clumps, leaving bald patches that I tried to hide with rags. My teeth became loose, leaving gaps that hissed when I tried to speak. But perhaps worse than the physical deterioration was the mental one. I began to see food where it didn't exist. I looked at stones on the ground and saw golden bread. I watched the shadows on the walls and saw ripe fruit swaying. My mind created constant mirages, hallucinations that made me salivate and reach out into the void. I talked to my own hunger as if it were a person. I bargained with it, begged it to give me a few minutes of respite, promised that I would find something to feed it if it would just stop hurting for a few moments. But hunger was a cruel companion, never accepting bargains and never offering mercy. My movements became mechanical, automatic. I walked through the aisles in search of anything edible, but my eyes no longer focused properly. Everything seemed blurry, distant, as if I were observing the world through murky water. My hands were constantly shaking, unable to hold small objects, dropping everything I tried to pick up. The cold became an additional enemy. Without body fat to keep me warm, every draft was torture. I wrapped myself in whatever fabric I could find, but nothing could warm the frozen bones. My body had become. Sleep became impossible because the cold woke me up more than my fatigue put me to sleep. And then came the terrible acceptance, the moment when my body and mind finally admitted that there was nothing more to be done, that all desperate attempts had failed, that Margaret was finally reaching the end of her journey. It was an acceptance that came not as relief, but as a deep and final sadness. My body had forgotten how to digest real food, but my soul never forgot the taste of lost dignity. The queen still demanded parties, while the kingdom fell apart. Her dresses shone brighter than ever, as if they could blind reality, the madness of the aristocracy in denial, while the world outside cried out in hunger and despair, while entire villages were abandoned and cities rebelled against famine. Here within the gilded walls of the palace, the madness took the form of even more extravagant feasts. The queen, in her absolute denial of reality, demanded banquets that surpassed anything we had prepared before. Their dresses became weapons of war against the truth. Each new outfit was more elaborate than the last, as if the amount of glitter and luxury could form a physical barrier against the bad news that came from the outside world. I saw dresses embroidered with pure gold threads, woven with precious stones that reflected the candlelight, creating showers of rainbows across the walls of the hall. She wore necklaces so heavy that it seemed like she had to work extra hard to hold her head up. Layers upon layers of pearls, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds made her neck an altar of ostentatious wealth. When she walked, the sound of the ornaments clashing created a metallic music that echoed through the halls, announcing her presence like the bells of a church dedicated to decadence. Their parties became rituals of collective denial. Guests arrived dressed as mythological characters, wearing elaborate masks that hid not only their faces, but also their humanity. They danced to orchestras that played increasingly loud melodies, as if the volume of the music could drown out the screams coming from the streets beyond the palace walls. The banquets of these recent times were obscene in their excess. dishes that took weeks to prepare, impossible combinations of ingredients that cost fortunes, presentations that defied the laws of physics and common sense. I saw sculptures made entirely of chocolate that represented epic battles, wine fountains that gushed golden liquid for hours, architectural cakes that reproduced entire cities in miniature. She insisted that each dish be a work of art, that each presentation surpass the last in grandeur. When Chef Auguste tried to suggest simplifications, she would interrupt him with dramatic gestures, declaring that extraordinary moments call for extraordinary celebrations. He failed to see that the moments were extraordinary precisely because of the despair, not the joy. The waste at these final banquets was criminal. Mountains of food were prepared for just a dozen guests who barely touched their plates before moving on to the next attraction. I saw entire peacocks discarded after just one bite, rare wines poured like ordinary water, elaborate desserts dismantled for the sake of momentary visual effects. But the most disturbing thing was watching the guests. They laughed too loudly, smiled too wide, spoke too quickly. Everything about them screamed despair, disguised as joy. These were people who knew their world was falling apart, but who had chosen collective madness as a way of coping with the terror of inevitable change. The Queen orchestrated all of this with a manic energy. Her eyes glowed with an intensity that was not health, but fever. She changed moods rapidly, going from euphoria to rage in a matter of seconds. She would yell at her servants over insignificant details, then laugh hysterically at jokes that no one else found funny. I remember a private banquet where she demanded that all the dishes be served on plates of pure gold, not gilded, but solid gold. The weight was so heavy that the weaker servants could not carry the trays. When a young servant dropped a dish, spilling truffle soup onto the marble floor, she showed no anger. Instead, she began to laugh, a high-pitched, prolonged laugh that chilled the blood of everyone present. Her dresses had become so elaborate that she needed help to sit, to stand, to move. It was as if she were building a luxurious suit of armor around herself, a protection against the reality gathering outside the palace walls. Every extra jewel, every extra layer of fabric, every unnecessary ornament was a barrier against the truth. During the last few banquets, she would rise from the high table, balancing precariously under the weight of her robes, and proclaim the eternity of her prosperity. She spoke of the loyalty of her subjects, the invincibility of her kingdom, and the golden future that awaited them all. Her guests applauded politely, but I could see the fear in their eyes. The madness of the aristocracy in denial was a palpable force during these events. It was like watching people dancing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground was crumbling beneath them, but unable to stop themselves. Each party was more desperate than the last, each celebration more hysterical, each moment of forced joy more obviously faked. And I, Margaret, skeletal and transparent, watched all this from the shadows of the kitchen. I saw how abundance can become a prison, how luxury can turn into madness, how denial can be the cruelest form of collective suicide. While they danced in their glittering dresses, I was wasting away in my own raw, honest reality. The palace was evacuated. The nobles fled. They left us to die among empty pots and cold ovens, the literal abandonment of the disposables. The evacuation began in the early hours of the morning, in the conspiratorial silence that precedes great betrayals. I awoke to a different movement in the palace, a muffled murmur that echoed through the stone corridors. It was not the coordinated, ritualistic movement of preparations for yet another banquet. It was something more frantic, more desperate, more final. For the first time in 20 years, Chef Auguste failed to show up for the kitchen opening. We waited in the dank darkness of the servants' dormitory, hearing hurried footsteps on the upper floors, voices whispering urgencies we couldn't decipher. When one of the older servants finally ventured to investigate, she found the administrative corridors empty, the office doors open, papers strewn across the floor like autumn leaves. The nobles fled like rats, abandoning a sinking ship. Carriages arrived in the night, silently laden with trunks containing decades of accumulated wealth, jewels, gold, works of art. Anything that could be transported quickly disappeared into the shadows of dawn. They left behind only the furniture too heavy to move, and us, the servants, who seemed even more disposable than the furniture. When the sun rose, we found the palace transformed into an empty shell. The main halls, which had echoed with laughter and music for decades, now held only silence and ghostly echoes. The tables that had held banquets that would feed entire villages stood bare, their polished surfaces reflecting only emptiness. The queen left without a word, without a warning, without even a backward glance. She, who had demanded so many elaborate banquets, who had insisted on impossible celebrations, even as the kingdom crumbled, had simply disappeared during the night. Her chambers were found empty, with only a few pieces of clothing left on the floor, as if she had stripped herself of her royal identity, along with her gowns. We, the servants, were left to die among empty pots and cold ovens. There was no formal dismissal, no final payment, not even an explanation. We were abandoned like useless objects, like tools that had lost their function. We were literally disposable, people who had been used to exhaustion, and then abandoned to find their own fates. The pantry, which had always been locked and guarded with military zeal, was found completely empty. Not just empty of food, but empty even of the containers that had stored food. They had taken everything, even the earthenware jars, even the linen sacks that had held grain. It was as if they wanted to ensure that nothing remained, that no trace of sustenance could prolong our agony. The other servants reacted differently to the abandonment. Some panicked, running through the empty hallways, screaming for Chef Auguste, for any authority figure who could explain what was happening. Others simply sat on the floor and began to cry, a deep, desperate cry that echoed through the stone vaults like a funeral dirge. Some tried to leave, to find their families of origin, to return to the villages they had come from decades before. But most of us had no family left, no home to return to. We had spent so long serving the palace that we had become part of it, and now, with the palace dead, we were dead too. The water was cut off on the second day. The springs that had been gushing clean water for centuries abruptly dried up, leaving only empty pipes that whispered like ghosts. Someone had cut off the supply, probably to keep us from prolonging our stay in the abandoned palace. They wanted us to leave quickly, to disappear as if we had never existed. The ovens, which had been burning day and night for decades, went out one by one, with no fresh wood to feed them, no coal to sustain their flames. They slowly died, releasing their last gasps of heat into the chilly air of the approaching autumn. The cold took over the kitchen like a living entity, transforming our workplace into an icy catacomb. We found a few coins forgotten in drawers, a few scraps of cloth that could be sold, a few tools that had some value, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. We had lived our entire lives depending on the palace for everything: food, shelter, purpose. Without it, we were like fish out of water, creatures who had forgotten how to survive in the real world. The abandonment was absolute and cruel. We were not people to them. We were just tools that had outlived their usefulness. Tools that could be discarded without a second thought, without a moment's consideration for what would become of us. We had dedicated our lives to serving their abundance, and when that abundance became unsustainable, we were simply forgotten. They left us to die among empty pots and cold ovens. And that's exactly what happened. Alone in the echoing corridors, searching for any remains, I talked to the pots and pans. They were my only company. The madness of extreme loneliness. After the others left, one by one I remained, not by choice, but by lack of alternatives. My body was too weak for a journey, my mind too confused to plan for the future. The empty kitchen became my entire world, a silent universe where every footstep echoed like a lonely thunder. The hallways that had once been filled with the constant din of work now amplified every sound I made. My unsteady footsteps on the cold stone created echoes that multiplied through the vaults, as if a host of ghostly Margarets were walking with me. Sometimes I would stop just to listen to these echoes, imagining that they were voices of companionship, that I was not completely alone. She searched for any remains with the dedication of an archaeologist exploring ancient ruins. Every cupboard was an excavation, every drawer an excavation, every hidden corner a possibility of discovery. She found breadcrumbs that had accumulated in forgotten corners, pieces of dried cheese that had fallen behind shelves, individual grains of rice that had rolled into crevices between the stones of the floor. My search became meticulous and obsessive. I knew every inch of that kitchen, every stone, every wooden beam, every corner where something edible might be hidden. I spent hours searching the same places over and over, always hoping to find something I had missed in the previous search. The pots became my confidants. It began as a need to hear a voice, even if it was my own. I spoke to them about the weather, about memories, about the fear I felt when night fell and the cold intensified. They listened to me silently, their copper surfaces reflecting my skeletal image like warped mirrors. "Good morning, Big Pot," I would say to the main pot, the one that had cooked soup for hundreds of people. "Do you remember when we were always busy? When you were always full of steaming broth?" I would run my hands over its cool surface, feeling the marks of age and use, and for a few moments, I could imagine that it was responding, that it was agreeing with my memories. Over the medium saucepan, I discussed the lost flavors. "Do you remember the truffle sauce we made at the fall party? The aroma that rose when you heated it?" She seemed to agree with me, her dark interior reflecting my thin face like a deep well of understanding. The small pot, the one that had been used for delicate sauces, became my counselor for existential questions. "Why are we still here?" I asked, sitting on the cold floor beside it. "Why didn't we leave when we still could?" And in its silence, I found every possible answer, and no satisfactory answer. The madness of extreme loneliness set in gradually, like a fog that thickens without you noticing. I began to hear voices that weren't there, whispered conversations coming from empty hallways. Sometimes I ran to investigate, always finding only empty air and more silence. Other times I responded to these phantom voices, carrying on entire conversations with non-existent interlocutors. The shadows became presences. When the sun went down and only a few dim candles lit the kitchen, the shadows danced on the walls like people moving. I greeted them, offered them imaginary food, asked them to stay and keep me company. Some nights, I was sure they would respond, wave back, sit with me around the central table. My routine became a ritual of psychological survival. I would wake up and greet each pot by the name I had invented for it. Then I would go on my daily search for food, always following the same pattern, visiting the same places in the same order. In the afternoons, I would sit in Chef Augusta's chair and tell stories to the pots, recreating memories of prosperous times. At night, when the cold grew, I would wrap myself in rags I had found and huddle between the larger pots, using them as shields against the wind that came in through the cracks. I would sing songs softly, songs my mother had sung to me when I was a child, songs that had been nearly forgotten during decades of silent labor. My appearance became ghostly. Without mirrors, I could only see my reflection in the polished surfaces of the pots, fragmented and distorted. My hair had turned white and thin, my translucent skin revealing every vein, every bone. Sometimes I didn't recognize myself in these reflections. I thought I was seeing the ghost of someone else. Time lost its meaning. There were no more meals to mark the hours, no more tasks to divide the days. I lived in an eternal present, where each moment stretched on infinitely. Sometimes I felt like I had only spent hours alone. Sometimes I was sure it had been years. I talked to the pots and pans about philosophy, about the meaning of life, about what happens after death. They were patient listeners, never interrupting me, never disagreeing. In their silent company, I found a strange kind of peace. Even in the growing madness, they were my only real companions, the only witnesses that Margaret had existed, had worked, had lived. And when I finally no longer had the strength to speak, I remained seated beside them, sharing the silence that had become our common language. I knew every recipe in the kingdom, but I never knew the taste of satiety. This is the phrase that sums up my existence. They called me, but I had a name, shadow, Margaret, and a hunger that no one has ever seen. I knew everything. He knew how to gild a hair until the skin shone like beaten copper. He knew the exact point at which honey stopped being sweet and became liquid gold. He knew which herbs calmed fever and which brought lucidity. I knew the order of the sauces, the weight of the seasonings, the time for the broths. He knew the queen's childhood dishes, the duke's secret desires, the ambassador's favorite ingredients. I knew which pies brought tears and which silences. He knew what fed the body of those who ruled the world, but I didn't know what it was to eat until I wasn't hungry anymore. I've never eaten without guilt. I never tasted it without hiding it. I never chewed without fear. The utensils he handled were made of silver, but my fingers were always bandaged, cut by the worn blades only servants used. The ladies' spoons sparkled in the light of the candelabra. Mine slept in damp boxes, stored away in shame. He cooked for kings, but he slept with his stomach pressed against his ribs. I was the one who seasoned the roasts with bay leaves and wine, but he was also the one who drank the warm water, forgotten at the bottom of the buckets. I prepared dinners for 100 people, and she hid crumbs in her apron pocket. He cleaned up every trace of the banquet with his bare hands, smeared with noble fat. And when the kitchen was empty, I searched among the bones for what could still sustain me until the next day. I died surrounded by utensils to prepare banquets that no longer existed. In the end, when the kingdom fell silent, when the halls no longer received footsteps or music, I remained there, in the back of the kitchen, surrounded by clean pots, empty pans, and perfectly organized shelves. Nobody came to get me. No one asked if I had left. The last spoons rested on the table. Like tired soldiers, I sat down on the cold stone floor. I leaned my head against the lime wall, and I closed my eyes. Hunger was no longer pain. It was company. I could still smell the roasts on my skin, but there was no more meat. I still remembered the texture of the cakes under my fingers, but there was no more flour. I could still hear the slow boiling of the broth in the pots, but there was no more fire. I died surrounded by what once fed others. I cooked it until the end. I cooked until there was no one left for me, until there is no more reason. The cruel irony is this: being responsible for feeding those who have never felt hungry and die without knowing what it's like to eat until you're full, having memorized the taste of every dish in the palace, but never having known the taste of true abundance. I spent my life measuring portions, but nobody measured mine. I made soup for the weak, broth for the sick, bread for the soldiers. But when I was the one who needed it, there was no soup, no bread, not a hand. The stove went out, and with it, the last flame in the royal kitchen went out. Today, I wander through these walls, like the smell of sautéed onions, subtle, forgotten, but still present for those who once paid attention. If you listen carefully, you can still hear me stirring the broth. You can still hear my breathing on the pan, my muffled humming between one cut and another. But nobody listens. No one ever heard. I was invisible while I was alive, and now I am noise. They said the servants were not hungry, function only. They said the palace was fair, but they forgot that hunger is not felt with the position. Feel with your body. Hunger was my only loyalty, the only presence that never left me. And even surrounded by everything, the pots, the spoons, the rare spices, I died with her. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but little by little, like a broth that evaporates, like if you heard my voice, that weak, invisible voice, made of wind and memory. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because even the invisible cooks also deserve to be remembered, even if they have never been fed. The last taste I remember was earth, earth in my mouth, earth in my heart. Before the palace, before the hunger disguised in silence, there was childhood, and in childhood, there was flavor. I remember my mother's bread. She made it with her calloused hands, mixing the flour that her father brought from the mill with water from the tap and a handful of salt stolen from the market basket. It was a rustic bread, dense, burnt at the edges, but when it was cut, it released a vapor that perfumed the kitchen as if it were a party. We ate it while it was still hot with our hands, tearing off pieces and passing them from one person to the other. There was nothing left, not a crumb, but there was laughter. There was presence. There was also the smell of vegetables picked from the backyard, carrots that came with the soil still stuck to them, deformed turnips, tiny potatoes, spring onions that my grandmother called green prayers. We ate everything. Everything was used. Everything had a name, taste, texture, story. I learned to identify the point of zucchini by the sound of the knife. I could tell when the cabbage was fresh by the smell it gave off when I chopped it. I knew that the broad bean soup was only ready when the broth was the color of wet clay. There were simple flavors, but there was no emptiness. A piece of cheese left on the windowsill gained the value of a treasure. An apple given by a neighbor was divided into 4, and the sugar, oh, the sugar was a miracle. It only appeared on special occasions, in an orange peel candy, or on a spoon dipped in tea. In that poor life, nobody ate much, but everyone ate together. I remember the taste of the herbal soup my mother made when someone was sick. It was big, bitter, healing, and the rosemary tea that my sister gave me when I cried in secret in my room. Nothing was sophisticated, but everything was full of presence, full of intention. Then came the palace, and the flavors changed. I started dealing with meats that I had never seen before: quails, pigeons, sea animals with hard shells and frightened eyes. I have seen fruits that looked like flowers, sauces that had so many ingredients that I needed a list to remember them. I cooked dishes with names in languages I didn't understand, recipes written on papers sealed with gold, dishes that required days of preparation, sleepless nights, steady hands. And there, among the rich broths and cured cheeses, what I lost was not just my appetite. I lost the simplicity. I lost the truth of the taste, because all of that was for decoration, to display, to show that the world could be eaten with the eyes. Even if the cook's stomach was empty, I didn't eat. It didn't prove. It just smelled. I will strike my hair from the mouth. The aroma of warmed wine, the scent of melted butter, the sweet touch of fig cream, everything reminded me of what I couldn't have. And that's how my body got used to the absence, like someone taking a deep breath before sinking, until one day, I felt nothing anymore. The mouth went dry. The tongue has lost its sense of taste. The nose fell silent. In the end, the last taste I remember was land. Yes, land. Dirt from the pantry floor that fell into my mouth when I first passed out. Cold land. Damp. Dura. Earth on the palate. Earth between the teeth. Earth in the heart. The contrast between the simple past and the luxurious present was like a knife. Sharp, silent, invisible. In childhood, little satisfied us. In the palace, the lot killed us. The nobles ate in a hurry, but left leftovers larger than the meals of my entire house. Banquets celebrated nothing. They were just empty rituals of a luxury that I no longer knew how to love. And there I was, in silence, stirring the pots and pans, remembering the smell of my mother's warm bread, the taste of an apple cut in half, of the bitter broth that healed, of the simplicity that fed. Today, I wander through empty kitchens, looking for that smell that made my eyes smile. But he's not here anymore. If you also miss a taste that wasn't just food, if you also carry in your mouth a taste that your soul does not forget, leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because there are flavors that never come back, but there are memories that never fade. And sometimes, remember, is what still feeds us. They ate with the hands I washed. I died with the hands that fed them. I never understood why our hands were invisible. They did everything. They carried buckets, washed dishes, stirred broth, polished the floor, sewed curtains, lit candles. But nobody looked at them as if they were part of the furniture, as if they were an extension of the house or out of nowhere. The queen's hands were white, small, fragile like porcelain. Mine were white too, but not out of politeness, due to lack of sun, because they washed so many pots with strong soap that they lost their color, their flesh, their youth. I washed their hands before dinner, with warm water, scented with flowers, kneeling, with embroidered towels that we couldn't touch outside of the ceremony. They smiled. They looked at me as if I were the wind or dust, and then they ate with those same hands hands that have never cut raw meat. They never carried sacks of flour. They never burned their fingers with hot grease. They never bled trying to open a wax-sealed jar. Mine, yes. My hands were cracked, dyed with onion and garlic, marked by time. It was with also by servitude that I prepared the dishes that delighted ambassadors. It was with them that I kept the fire burning on stormy nights. It was with them that I washed the blood of the dead wild boars to decorate the tables. And it was with them that I died, empty hands, no spoon, no bread, without affection. They served me until the end. Even when the rest of the body no longer obeyed, they were still stirring the soup. They were still cleaning the rim of the plate. They even placed the napkins at the right angle. When I stopped, no one noticed. They thought I had fallen asleep, standing up, or passed out from exhaustion. But no, I had simply stopped, because what moved me no longer existed. The injustice of my death was not the end in itself. It was silence around her, the normality with which they let me fall. They continued eating, with the hands I had washed. No one asked why the soup took longer that day. No one noticed that the bread was uncut. No one saw that the wine glass had not been refilled. And if they saw, they didn't say, because I wasn't part of the meal. I was just what happened before her. And then I was on the floor for hours, with eyes open. The ceiling of the hall reflected the candles like a false sky. And I looked at him thinking, does justice live up there? But I didn't want revenge. No punishment, no return. I just wanted to be seen. Once, I wished someone had held my hand and said, or even thank you, you are here. The social order has never been questioned among us. Since I was a child, I learned that there were those who ate, and those who served, those who entered through the main door, and those who could never be seen in the marble corridor, those who had a name on people's lips, and those who had numbers on their pantry cards. I was number. It was an apron. It was a silent step. And yet, I had a soul. I had thoughts. I was hungry for food, but also of justice, equality. On break, I've never told anyone that. I never dared. Not out of fear, but for sure. Sure no one would hear. In my death, there was no justice, but there was truth. The truth is that those who support the castles die crushed beneath them. The truth is that an empire can fall because of a cook who is too tired to get up. I didn't want revolution. I didn't even raise any flags. I just wanted to be remembered. I wish someone knew that behind every banquet was a hungry woman with pain in the bones, missing my childhood, a woman who hated no one. But he also didn't understand how the world could be so deaf. Today, I walk through empty kitchens. I touch the pots that shine, but that no longer cook. I hear the echoes of the nameless dinners I served, and I still ask, quietly, without waiting for an answer, has anyone here washed their hands yet? If you heard me, if you understood this sadness without a cry, this pain that doesn't hurt, but weighs, leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because even the most tired hands deserve to be remembered, not as tools, but like stories. I still hear the clink of golden glasses. In the end, when the light began to fade inside me, what was left was not the cold, it was the sound, not the sound of death, but of the banquets. I heard the nobles' laughter before I saw them. They echoed off the kitchen walls. Even though the halls were empty, there were no more dinners. There were no more parties, but there were echoes. Maybe my soul got caught up in the sound of the cutlery, to the clink of crystal glasses, to silver spoons scraping the bottom of dessert glasses. Everything came back like a dance. I saw the servants lining up the napkins. I saw the butler giving orders with his eyes. I saw the pheasant dish passing from hand to hand as if it were sacred. And I saw the queen, dressed in the deepest blue, the same one she wore the night the French ambassador came. She smiled. He smiled, as if he still reigned, as if hunger hadn't torn down the palace's columns. The voices came back with her, voices I knew, but that never belonged to me. Voices that spoke in codes, in words filled with power, but empty of meaning. They laughed, and I listened. They laughed as they pretended to discuss the future of the kingdom. They laughed between sips of aged wine that I myself organized in the cellar. The clinking of glasses. How that sound haunted me. It was like music, a cruel song, made for those who had a mouth but no bread, made for those who dreamed of silence, but lived surrounded by gold. The glasses clinked together like bells, and the bells sang of the luxury that saved no one. They raised toasts, but not by the cooks, not by the vegetable washers, not by the cleaning ladies, never for me. The biggest haunting was not seeing the ghosts of the nobles. It was obvious that they continued eating, even dead, even absent, even after everything fell apart. They continued eating, cutting meat that didn't exist, wetting lips in wines that have dried, laughing at jokes that no one told anymore. And me? I served them, again, as if my body hadn't already stopped, as if death had not freed me, as if hunger still ruled. The tray was heavy in his hands were no longer there, and yet I held her. It passed between them like smoke, and no one saw me. A knight raised his cup and said, "To silent loyalty." I looked around. Everyone toasted, everyone smiled, but nobody knew my name. It was as if death had torn me from the world without offering me relief, as if I had been condemned to relive what consumed me, the ritual that erased me. The room was beautiful. Chandeliers hung like moons. The chandeliers shone even without light. The marble floor reflected the footsteps of vain ghosts. I saw the children of the nobility running. I saw the dogs being fed leftovers from dishes I never touched. I saw the musicians, long dead, still playing, violins, harps, silver flutes, and me, there, in the corner, listening. Hunger was no longer part of the body, but the sound of the banquet was part of me. It was a kind of condemnation, reviving what never belonged to me. Serve what I've never eaten, listening to the joy of someone who has never seen me. This is what death gave me, the last visions of a world where I was needed but never left, where I was a base but never a structure, where I was invisible and continued to be, even on the other side. Sometimes I hear my own footsteps on the stone floor. They blend in with the clinking of glasses, as if I were just another cup, one more dish, another party object. When someone passes through the kitchen of the old palace, they say they feel a strange cold, a light noise, a whisper. It's not wind. It is me, Margaret, serving again. If this story touched you, if you too have ever felt that your existence was seen but never seen, leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because there are voices that keep echoing even after the last banquet, even after the silence. I am not asking for justice. It is too late for that. I just ask that someone remember that we were hungry too. I don't expect reparations, neither by monuments nor by prayers. I don't want someone to write my name in the stone or sing songs with my story. But if just one soul remembers that we were here, that will be enough, because the world quickly forgets those who supported its columns with their own bodies, those who extinguished their own desires to ignite the desires of others, those who cleaned the floor with their hands while others crossed halls with light steps. Hunger is not just the absence of food, it is the absence of place, by name, of affection, and we had all these hungers at the same time. But we don't complain, not by submission, more for costume, by inheritance, because as children, we learned that silence was the currency that gave us permission to exist. We were taught to fold cloths, not desires, carrying trays, no questions asked, silencing pain with work and tiredness with obedience. Today, after death, I do not carry anger. I bring memories. I remember the smell of warm bread and soup I never tasted. I remember my mother's face when she taught me how to peel potatoes in silence. I remember a friend's hidden laughter in the basement pantry. I remember everyone who died without witnesses, without anyone saying, please, thank you, or you're here. If I had had a choice, maybe I would have asked for little. Maybe a piece of old cheese with dark bread. Maybe just someone to look at me and say, you matter. But we didn't have that. We had brooms, pans, worn-out aprons. We had promises of rest that never came. We only had the work. And in the end, silence. It's funny how death brought me clarity. Here, among the shadows of what I was, I understand that I do not need justice as men understand it, because the justice I ask for is not punishment. It's a memory. I just ask that someone, sometime, look at an empty palace and think, who kept it standing? Who lit the fire? Who washed the silver? Who starved to death, cooking for kings? I don't want revolution. I wish memory, because memory is the only dish that doesn't wear out, the only wine that doesn't evaporate, the only supper that feeds those who are gone. I accept what I was, not with joy, but with dignity. I was an invisible cook. I was hunger in the form of a person. I was what nobody wanted to see, but I went, and that's enough. I now sit on the threshold of what was once the kitchen. I look at the world through a window that no one else opens, and I whisper my name so that the wind carries it between the cracks of some memory. Margaret, daughter of a simple woman, cook of kings, starving in the heart of luxury. I can still hear the cutlery, but I don't cry anymore. There is no sadness where there is acceptance. There is only a calm emptiness, like the hall after the party, like the clean pot at the end of the day. Every now and then, a child comes in here, play with the spoons, pretend to prepare banquets with dry leaves and twigs. She smiles, and I smile with her, because maybe, without knowing it, she is reminding me. And if there is memory, there is return. I don't ask for justice. I don't expect statues. I just ask that someone say, even in their thoughts, she was here, and he was also hungry. If this story found space in your silence, if you have heard that faint voice coming from the forgotten kitchens of the world, leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because even the smallest stories deserve a listening ear, and even those who died of hunger deserve to be remembered with dignity. If you listen to this story while eating something, chew slowly. Feel the weight of the bread in your hand, the warmth it leaves on your fingers, the sound it makes when it leaves. And think of me, Margaret, who prepared thousands of meals, who greased baking trays, who blew broths so that others wouldn't burn their mouths. But he never had a single supper to call his own. Think of me, not like a ghost, but like a living memory, a small voice with a crumpled apron that still haunts the empty kitchens of the world. I knew the smell of food before it had a name. I knew when the bread was ready just by hearing the oven. He recognized the hands that seasoned with love and those that simply followed orders. But the taste, this one was denied to me. I saw desserts that looked like art, cakes that defied gravity, sauces that sparkled under candlelight. I saw fruits that came from far away, which no one dared to touch without permission. I saw everything, and I proved nothing. The mouth that chews with satiety does not understand the weight of chewing with guilt, with shame, in a hurry, afraid of being seen. If you are eating while listening, chew slowly. Think about the food that is in front of you, and in the absence he carries for so many. Think of the spoon that spins your morning coffee, in the deep dinner plate, in the carelessly folded napkin. Think about every little thing, because every little thing is a luxury for those who could never ask for one more spoon. For years I served banquets, and in the end, what was left for me was the smell. Just that, a smell that stuck to my bones and followed me even after death. I don't ask for tears. I don't ask for revolt. I just ask that the next time you sit at the table, let there be a brief reminder. Let a second of your thoughts say, she existed, she was hungry, and that's enough to keep me going, at least in my memory. The story ends here, but the silence I leave behind me still walks the halls. It still heats imaginary pots. It still sings softly among the steam of the broths that no longer boil. If you felt this story in any part of your body, in the stomach, in the chest, in the back of the neck, then I was heard, and be heard. It was what I always wanted. Think of Margaret, who prepared thousands of meals, but he never had one to himself. And if, at some point in your life, you also had to take care of others on an empty stomach, if you also swallowed your tears to keep someone's plate full, so you are Margaret too. You understand me. You take me with you. Ultimately, what sustains us is not just food. It's the gesture. It's recognition. It is knowing that we exist beyond what we serve. So, I take my leave, not as a victim, not like heroin, but as a voice, the voice of so many others, of the cooks who died without a name, of mothers who scraped the bottom of pots to feed their children, of the servants who disappeared from the official stories, of those who were hungry, and yet they kept cooking. But before I leave something, a smell, a sound, one sentence, a presence. Perhaps if you close your eyes, right now, you can hear the sound of a wooden spoon hitting the bottom of the pan, or the whisper of an ancient recipe floating through the air, or just silence, but a silence loaded with truth. And if you hear, so Margaret was not in vain. Now, before blowing out the candle, before closing the night, I leave an invitation. In the next story, you will hear the voice of another forgotten one, someone who walked under the stones of the castle, but never looked at the sky, someone who has seen power up close, and yet he died in the dark. I can't say who it is yet, but I know his voice needs to be heard too, maybe more than mine. So if you're still here, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready, because the next silence also has a story to tell.